there's this certain weight that the word album sales has, and I think that a lot of different fans are starting to get into the metrics. A lot of people are starting to consider the first week sales. A lot of people are starting to understand, let's say, streaming numbers and monthly listeners, whatever goes into it, right? Hip hop by the numbers, hip hop all day, two fantastic platforms that cover it, nice fan bases. People are genuinely invested into this type of journalism and media because there's a lot of nice conversations you could have around it. I feel as if when looking at music, it's maybe the only black and white thing that you could truly look at, because album quality, track list, I feel like that's more on the subjective though, right? There's no guidelines to look at that. But when it comes to album sales and all of the metrics and money that goes behind it, it's very black and white, like it's either did it do well or did it not do well? So what type of weight do you think that, the word album sales has right now and let's say your listenership, and how have you considered it over the years?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a perspective for people that, use album sales to see how an album's performed, to compare it to other artists, because that's what we love doing when we're talking music. We love debating about who crafts better albums, who puts up better first week sales. And again, like you said, the only objective conversation you can have when debating music is really, who's performing higher on that commercial level. But lately in the industry, I feel like when it comes to album sales, there's been this narrative that higher album sales equates to higher music quality. And I feel like that's totally fucking false. And this has been happening after Kendrick Lamar dropped his album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. That's kind of the more recent example that we have. And there's some takes on Twitter that were pretty alarming to me. So one user wrote, Kendrick Lamar's album flopped, we lit. Somebody else said, y'all can't accept that Kendrick's most hyped project low-key flopped and barely has any replay value, face reality. And another user wrote, when Gunna can do 150,000 copies first week and Future almost did 250,000 copies first week, Kendrick flopped doing 295,000 copies first week. And this was kind of blasphemous to me just because Kendrick had the highest first week sales of the entire year. He had every single song on the album chart on the Billboard Hot 100. And I think the reason why people are, putting up this narrative is because we're comparing this to his previous album, Damn, which sold over 600,000 copies first week, but it was very different. Merch bundles were involved. You had a huge single like Humble that came out prior to the album release. And right now, we're seeing that the biggest artists in the world, like Drake and Adele, they can't reach the same heights either. They're not putting up 1 million first week. They're kind of in that 600, 700, 800 range. And a big reason is because the way that we're calculating these album sales has changed according to Billboard. So should I break it down?
Absolutely. Let's go into this because what you did was interesting. You went to before 1991, and then there was a major shift in 91, and then you went all the way to the year 2020, where that was where the merch bundles were completely, dismantled. So like they were no longer a part of the equation. So go through the timeline, man.
Absolutely.
Rip through it.
So before 1991, Billboard would survey record shops across the United States and ask for their ranked list of their best-selling albums of the week, and they would aggregate that into a list. And this method obviously was like prone to manipulation by the record labels, by retailers who were kind of, they had their biases. Maybe they were paying a little bit to have their albums ranking at the top of those lists. But then in 1991, on May 25th, Nielsen SoundScan became the official data provider for the Billboard 200 chart. And of course, the 200 chart informs you on which albums are the highest selling of that week. And then, the way that SoundScan actually works is that after you purchase an album, they would scan the barcodes in stores, and retailers can then produce a list of the best-selling albums by the actual number of copies being sold, rather than just a ranked list from a survey. Then jump to 1999, and we saw that album sales by volume peaked at 1.1 billion albums sold annually. And since that year, the total annual number of albums sold has continuously decreased. And this is interesting too, because over the years, SoundScan has adapted its technology to consumer trends and to be able to track digital activity. Now that we're kind of having the streaming era kind of take hold of the industry, things have changed. So jump to 2014, and then this term of the album equivalent unit became introduced. And this is pretty much a measurement that defines the consumption of music that equals to the purchase of one album copy. So of course, this factors in streaming numbers, it factors in song downloads, and that all adds into all of the traditional album sales as well. So for example, 3,750 streams would equal to one album copy sold. And it's interesting because as the 2010s rolled around, artists, grabbed onto this tactic of attaching their albums
To merch bundles.
to merch bundles or
Yeah.
to concert tickets, and then it became a question of like, are these artists selling the music or are they selling a piece of clothing? And we saw that
and
with Travis Scott, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Travis sold over 500,000 copies first week, and if you look at the jump from Birds in the Trap, Sing McKnight, and listen, we understand how an artist could definitely garner a lot of hype within years, and how things are obviously going to grow exponentially. But I believe he sold 88,000 copies first week with Birds, and then after that, you look at Astroworld, and it ends up selling over 500,000 first week. That's ridiculous. And honestly, good for the artist, because from an artist perspective, right? Like if we look at this and say like, okay, like, what type of merit do the album sales hold? Absolutely, right? You want to be the most, successful artist in the world. Everyone wants their flowers. And I also respect that, the artists that don't want to go by that route and want to stick it to the art. And I think that it's interesting how every artist could, play on that spectrum. How much do I want to sell? How much do I want to tap into that marketable sound? And how will it affect, my career decisions
Yeah,
going
because
forward?
music is a business at the end of the day. But I do like the fact that in 2020, Billboard did change the rules and they announced that they would no longer be counting merchant ticket bundles because, those numbers were no longer an accurate representation of music sales. Because at the end of the day, you're selling music. That's what it should be. And that was kind of a complaint that Nicki Minaj had in 2018 when she was going head to head with Astroworld with her album Queen. So, I mean, obviously artists are kind of, they have different opinions about it, but I think it was for the best for that rule to be scrapped. And it's very interesting because it brings us to this subject of how much weight do album sales really hold, and do they matter, and why don't they matter?
Yeah, let's play a bit of devil's advocate.
Yeah, let's play a bit of devil's advocate. So why do you think album sales matter? Because I feel like the first perspective to look at is definitely the perspective of the artists and the record labels, because for example, having an album have a high, charting position on the Billboard 200 chart, that's a marketing tool in itself for you to have, let's say, the number one album in the country. Not only that, but it's very crucial to look at those first few weeks of an album's release, to look at it and be like, okay, this album flopped. Let me not push, further with this rollout.
Absolutely.
Let me not put more marketing dollars into these big budget music videos.
And there's a lot of and there's a lot of different marketers in the industry that are probably doing that right now and saying like, okay, like I was talking to a couple of people that, they'll look at, let's say, their album performance, and like they'll be cutting their budgets depending on, if the product was successful or not, and even looking at it from a rollout standpoint, right? Because we're both digital marketers, right? We understand how the landscape works, even with e-com and retail and anything outside of, let's say, music, right? There's always this sort of thing where, you have to maximize your return on investment on whatever you're putting money into. And that's obviously, what the goal of the record labels is, to be able to maximize their profits. And whenever they're pumping budgets into artists, well, it's the control of that money and how much you're actually losing out of it and what you're getting back. So what's interesting about these rollouts is that the statistics will directly give you a vision and a clear black and white answer on are you making that money back and what's your return on investment. So I find it interesting from a business standpoint, but we have to remember that we're dealing with art here, and I'm always a guy that likes to really understand what the art is first before I even look at let's say the album sales, because there's the whole conversation of impact. Oh, let's say an album does over 1 million copies first week. Well, okay, the impact is undeniable. And yes, I do agree with that, but that does not necessarily translate into quality. For example, last year I had Bo Jackson, by Boldy James and The Alchemist over Donda in my top 10, albums of the year list. I also think that this year, let's say one of the best albums that I heard, let's say something that's in my top 10 at the moment, is from, an artist named Noah, Mirrors in a Mausoleum. Like, I definitely do think that at a certain point we have to cut the statistics out of the quality conversation, because then there's a flaw to the equation.
Oh, it definitely holds no weight. You know what I mean? McDonald's sells the most burgers, but they don't have the best quality burger at the end of the day. So I feel like where album sales do matter is that it's a very cool metric to look at to observe the performance of an album. Not only that, but it's cool to see the growth an artist can have from one album to the next. For example, I saw a lot of people clowning Jack Harlow for only selling 130,000 copies first week with Come Home, the Kids Miss You, because people had these high expectations. He had the Drake feature, First Class was popping off. But if you track back a bit and look at what his debut album sold, that's what they all say, it sold like 55,000 copies first week. And now this album almost doubled the sales, selling 130,000 copies. So I love seeing kind of the growth of the artist on a commercial level. I think that's a reason why I like observing the numbers. Not only that, but it's fun to kind of just predict what this album is going to sell first week based on the rollout. How successful was this promotion? Not only that, but I feel like, I'm someone that likes looking at numbers from a statistical standpoint in any entertainment field. For example, looking at what a movie does, first weekend at the box office, that's cool to me. Looking at, what players are putting up in a season points wise, I like looking at those numbers. It doesn't mean that it's going to equate to quality, but at the end of the day, it is still pretty dope to look at that. But I feel like it's also rooted in comparison. For example, this has been going on in music history for a long time, where if, for example, in 2007, we had 50 Cent's Curtis going head to head with Kanye West Graduation. And
Massive
that was
moment.
a huge push for both of those fucking albums. And it was cool to see who's going to outsell who. These artists are both at their peak level. We also saw it in 2021 with, Donda and Certified Lover Boy. So I think I like that as a music fan, seeing the competitive nature. But again, just because one album sells more than another doesn't mean that it's better.
Yeah, there's also an interesting conversation to be bringing into, the commercial value. Because example, like Call Me If You Get Lost, like those first week numbers were still very impressive. They were still really good for, let's say today's day and age in 2021 and 2022. Even looking at Mr. Brown, The Big Steppers, the off season, these Donda, these albums are quality and they're still going mainstream. So do you think that's the sweet spot? Are the guys that are able to, let's say, really hit it on the nose, where they're able to deliver you quality soundtracks and projects while being able to still, have that competitive edge commercially to their albums?
Absolutely. You can sell 2,000 copies first week and have the best album of the year at the end of the day, right? And I think that we have to kind of, let free of all the smoke and mirrors of the promotion and the marketing when we're talking about actual music quality, because I hate the fact that there's so many people that have that opinion that, you're deeming the performance of an album more valuable than an artist's actual skill and talent on a project.
Absolutely, but I think this is where people fuck up, though, is that they'll have that bias when they'll look at an album. They may not even have heard the album, and they'll still be in those Twitter comments just trolling. And I think what the real shame is that they're gypping themselves out of an album experience, because they feed into that culture, let's say online, where, let's say if an artist does not meet the expected first week sales, right? Like, let's say the Kendrick Lamar situation, I'm sure there's a lot of those people, in those comment sections that were commenting about the first week sales, that if they would have given that album a chance, they would have genuinely enjoyed it. And I think that that's what we have to stop doing, maybe as music listeners, is being like, okay, there's a certain narrative around this album and this track list. Let me not appreciate it as much, even going into it. Like before I heard the music, before I hear anything, I'm going to go in with that prejudgment. And I think people are low-key robbing themselves of that experience now, just because, hey, let me fuel into a comment section.
You think, like, let's say a fan is trying to get into an artist that they haven't heard before. Do you think looking at, let's say, how much an album put up first week will dictate if they're going to be keen to going into that album or not?
I think for people, I think obviously, because it is a marketing tactic at the end of the day, and it does influence the listener. Listen, if it did not affect us, let's say the consumers, you and I, those numbers and those metrics would not be marketed, and they would not be pushed through our PR team. So I think that that's what we have to keep, let's say, in mind right now, is that it's almost playing against the fan, where, like, you could pump in as much marketing as you want within an album, and, like, people are going to get kind of jaded at what the actual quality is, and then they're going to be like, okay, you know what, just because, like, this was the most commercially successful album of the year, all kinds of people are loving it, I'm forced to buy into this track list now. And I think that's the psychology going into it now for a lot of different fans, and that's kind of scary, because now you're forming your opinions off of media and PR, not rather going into the album and actually enjoying this as an album
It's
experience.
really interesting. But let me ask you this too, because when we're looking at, let's say, some of the most successful albums of all time, let's take it to the hip-hop genre, would we really have the same music that we have today if it wasn't, let's say, for an album like Kanye West, 808s and Heartbreak, which did sell a lot of copies first week? So I feel like,
even, let's say, Eminem's The Marshall
but that's
Mathers
what I'm
LP,
saying.
right?
Like, would music be the same if these numbers didn't reach as many people as they did? And I think that's another kind of argument as to why album sales do matter, is that if you don't have the audience to reach, then your ideas cannot be, ideas that pioneer the future of music.
Absolutely,
right?
and I want to build up upon that idea, because even looking at, let's say, some of the most successful first week sales of all time, some of the highest selling rap albums, right, like the Carter 3, or even, let's say the Marshall Mathers LP, like, Speaker Box, let's say, like, these are quality pieces of art where, like, you're getting some of the best material that's ever hit the genre. And I think that that's what has to be done, is, the influence has to be there, but the quality has to be there. Because think about it, you have an effect over a population. You're responsible now for the people that are listening to your music. You're deciding whether you're giving them quality or not. And there's obviously a lot of different factors that go into that decision. Example, record labels will make creative decisions for artists. Or let's say, you have yes men in the room making decisions for you, let's say on production choices or verses you're laying down. There's all kinds of different factors that we can't necessarily measure at the moment. But looking at what's really hit first week and what's been successful for the rap genre, it's low-key been all quality, man.
Yeah.
I really can't think of anything in that top 5 that I didn't enjoy personally.
I think though, like that's the sweet spot that a lot of artists strive to achieve, is having that mix of an album that's speaking to a lot of people, that's selling a lot first week and in general, as the years go on, while also having an album that, let's say, is quality and has meaningful lyrics, meaningful ideas, music that people could vibe to, music that's timeless. I feel like if you can kind of mix all of that in, you have the perfect recipe for a quality album.
Absolutely. And a lot of different fans do think that social media exposure directly, correlates to, let's say, album sales and commercial success. And that's completely false. Example, going back to 2020, quarantine radio was popping off. I'm not sure if you remember that phase for Tory Lanez.
Yeah.
He was reaching crazy heights in his lives. There was people genuinely interested, and people looked at that 50,000 reach first week for the new Toronto 3 and kind of a slighted away, because they were like, you have all these people coming into your lives, why aren't they transitioning into album sales? And I don't think people understand how hard it is to be able to garner these album sales. You have to go through full rollouts with well calculated marketing tactics that is going to influence a population of people to really go flock to your album first week and have that longevity on the charts. Example, like, people will look at first week sales and they'll dictate the success of an album based on that. But look at something like GKMC that's, didn't have necessarily the first week chartings that, let's say, an album like Damn did, but it's one of the highest, longest charting albums of all time on the Billboard 200. So
yeah, and I also want to just add that I think that a lot of fan bases, what they will do is that when they're trying to defend their artist's album, instead of relating to the music, they'll say, well,
that's bullshit.
YB sold more. YB's the better artist because he's putting up
don't single
all these
out YB,
numbers.
though.
I'm not singling out anybody. I'm just using YB as an example because a lot of his fan base kind of will go towards the plaques and towards the numbers to defend his musical capabilities, and I feel like that's totally wrong. But it is the one clutch that you can go back to because statistically and factually speaking, that's all we have as music fans, right?
I know, I get you. But it's always an interesting conversation because it's always up for debate, guys. So let us know how you feel about this conversation in the comment section. And let Lou and I know where we fucked up within it and, where you disagree with us. We're always down to see that. And guys, if this is your first NFR podcast experience, please subscribe to the channel because we are doing content on a daily basis. Thank you so much for watching this episode, and we'll catch you in the next one.